The final card hit the whiskey-stained table, and with it, the last of Jeb's dignity crumbled into dust. The saloon went dead silent, a silence heavier than a tombstone. Jeb didn't look at the pile of chips he had lost. Instead, he looked at the door, straight at his own daughter, Sarah. His eyes weren't filled with an apology, but with a cold, desperate calculation. "I can't pay you in silver, Captain," Jeb stammered, his voice trembling as he pointed a shaking finger at the young woman standing frozen in the doorway. "But she's got to be worth the debt. Take her. She's strong. She'll do whatever you say." The captain, a man whose smile looked like a jagged scar, stood up and walked toward her, looking her up and down like she was a prize mare at an auction. Sarah wanted to scream, to run, but fear had turned her boots to lead. The captain reached out a dirty, gloved hand to claim his new property. But before his fingers could graze her shoulder, a voice deep as a canyon echo cut through the smoky air. "She has no price." Every head turned. Standing in the shadows was a man clad in buckskins, with eyes like burning coals, and a hand resting casually on the hilt of a massive Bowie knife. The devil himself couldn't have looked more dangerous. And in that moment, the entire room knew. Blood was about to spill. This is your narrator, Marcus, from Frontier Rescue Stories. If you love tales of the Old West, of survival, redemption, rugged justice, and romance that blooms against all odds, you have come to the right place. Before we dive into this journey, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, share this video, and smash subscribe. Your support helps us stir up the algorithm and bring these campfire tales to a larger audience. Also, I love hearing from you, so drop a comment down below and let me know which part of the world you are tuning in from today. Now, check your cinches and load your iron. Let's get into the story. Everything stopped in that saloon. But the clock had started ticking on Sarah's life 4 days earlier. It was a Tuesday, a day that began like every other in the God-forsaken settlement of Dust Creek. The sun hadn't even crested the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains. But Sarah was already awake. She lay still on her straw mattress, listening to the rhythmic, gravelly snoring of the man she called Pa. Jeb wasn't her real father. Her real pa, a blacksmith with hands as strong as iron and a heart as soft as cotton, had died when she was just 13, crushed under the hooves of a spooked stallion. Her mother had followed him into the grave a winter later, taken by a fever that swept through the valley like a wildfire. That left Sarah at 17, with no kin and no coin, forced to rely on Jeb. He was a man 20 years her senior, a sour-faced farmer whose land grew more rocks than crops. He wasn't a man who beat her, I'll give him that. He didn't yell much either, but he didn't love her. To Jeb, Sarah was just a useful piece of furniture that breathed. She was a broom that swept, a pair of hands that scrubbed the floors, and a back that carried water from the well. That morning, the cabin smelled like it always did, a thick, suffocating mix of stale tobacco smoke, unwashed heavy wool, and the sharp sting of cheap whiskey. Sarah rose silently, her bare feet cold on the dirt floor. She braided her copper hair tight to keep it out of her eyes and set to work. She stoked the embers in the hearth, feeding them kindling until a fire crackled to life. She mixed cornmeal and water, the rhythmic slapping of the dough between her hands, serving as the only prayer she knew. Jeb woke with a grunt, scratching at a beard that looked like a bird's nest. He sat on the edge of his cot, staring at nothing with eyes glazed over by last night's bottle. "Is it ready?" he croaked, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Yes," Sarah replied, not bothering to turn around. He ate quickly like a starving dog, wiping his mouth with the back of a dirty hand. Then he stood up, grabbing his worn hat. "I'm heading to the trading post, business." Sarah didn't ask what kind of business. She knew. Business meant finding a card game at the Rusty Spur Saloon. It meant drinking until he couldn't see, straight and gambling, away money they didn't have. She just watched him go, a sinking feeling in her gut that today was going to be different, though she couldn't say why. Her day was a blur of hard labor. She washed clothes in a wooden tub until her knuckles were raw and red. She hung patched shirts to dry under the relentless sun. On her way to the community well, she ran into the widow Hattie, a woman bent double by time but with eyes sharp as a hawk's. "You watch yourself, child," Hattie warned, her voice cracking. "Word is there's mountain men in the valley. Came down to trade furs. Those trappers are wild folk. They bring trouble wherever they step." Sarah offered a tired smile. "Mountain men come and go, Hattie. We got soldiers here. We'll be fine." She didn't believe the soldiers protected anyone but themselves, but she said it to be polite. The military garrison in Dust Creek was mostly there to tax the smugglers, not to save settlers from danger. Night fell and the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the log cabin. Sarah waited. She sat by the door watching the dark road. Jeb didn't come home for dinner. He didn't come home when the moon hit its peak. She eventually fell asleep in her chair, wrapped in a thin shawl, listening to the dust scratch against the walls. It was the gray light of dawn on the third day when her world shattered. A fist pounded on the door. Not a knock, a demand. The wood groaned under the force. Sarah jumped up, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She opened the door with trembling hands. 2 soldiers stood there, their blue uniforms stained with trail dust, rifles slung over their shoulders. And between them, slumped like a sack of grain, was Jeb. He looked bad. His face was bruised, his eyes bloodshot and terrified. He smelled so strongly of spirits it nearly knocked Sarah back. "Your pa has a debt," the taller soldier said. He had a thick mustache and eyes cold as a winter creek. "He owes Captain Miller $180. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. 180? They barely had 15 cents to their names. We don't have that kind of money," she whispered. "We know," the younger soldier sneered. "That's why we're here." Jeb looked up then, but he didn't look at Sarah. He looked at his boots. I can get it," he stammered, lying through his broken teeth. "Just give me time." "Time's up, old man," the tall soldier growled. "Captain wants his payment tonight. Get dressed, girl. You're coming with us." "Me? Why me?" Sarah gasped. "Because your father decided it that way," the soldier said flatly. The words hit her harder than a physical blow. Jeb had traded her. Sarah looked at the man who had raised her for 11 years, waiting for him to fight, to scream, to grab a pitchfork and defend her. But he just shrank into himself, a coward to the bone. "Pa," she pleaded, "tell them no." But the soldiers didn't wait for an answer. They grabbed her by the arms, their grip bruising her flesh. She struggled, digging her heels into the dirt. But they were too strong. They dragged her out of the cabin and down the main street of the settlement. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, watching the spectacle. Nobody stepped out. Nobody said a word. In Dust Creek, you didn't cross the soldiers. They marched her straight to the square in front of the saloon. Under the flickering light of an oil lamp, a poker table was set up outside, surrounded by a crowd of jeering men, traders, gamblers, and soldiers. Sitting at the head of the table was Captain Miller. He was a bear of a man, with scars mapping his face and a belt heavy with ammunition. He stood up slowly as they shoved Sarah toward him. He looked at her the way a butcher looks at a side of beef. Cold, calculating, evaluating. "So," Miller grunted, a crooked smile revealing yellowed teeth. "This is the collateral." Sarah felt naked under their stares. She looked frantically for Jeb, who had shuffled into the corner of the square, burying his face in his hands. "Pa, please," she cried out, her voice breaking. "You can't do this. I'm your daughter." Jeb finally looked up, his eyes dead and empty. "I have nothing else left, Sarah," he mumbled, his voice hollow. "Forgive me." There was no sorrow in his voice, just the pathetic resignation of a man who valued his own skin over her soul. Captain Miller stepped closer, his heavy boots crunching in the dirt. He reached out a hand, his thick fingers hovering inches from her face. "Easy now, girl," he mocked as the men around the table laughed. "You'll pay off his debt soon enough. It won't hurt. Much." Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, terror paralyzing her lungs. This was it. This was how her life ended. Sold for a bad hand of cards. Miller's hand moved to grab her chin. And that's when the voice thundered from the darkness, stopping the captain dead in his tracks. "She has no price." The stranger's voice hung in the air, heavy as the silence before a thunderstorm. Every eye in the square turned to him. Standing at the edge of the lamplight, under the skeletal branches of a dead oak tree, was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of the mountain itself. He was tall, his skin bronzed by years of wind and sun, dressed in buckskins that had seen better days but were clearly well cared for. His black hair fell long over his shoulders, wild and untamed. At his waist hung a heavy pistol and a hunting knife that looked sharp enough to split a hair. but it was his eyes that held the room captive. Eyes that burned like coals in a deep fire pit. Captain Miller, recovering from his shock, sneered at the newcomer. "And who the hell are you to interrupt my business?" The mountain man didn't blink. He didn't even twitch. "Someone who knows a woman isn't a poker chip or a debt to be settled," he replied, his voice calm but with an edge of steel that made the soldiers shift uncomfortably. "This isn't your concern, trapper," Miller spat, his hand drifting toward his holster. "Walk away while you still have legs to carry you." "It became my concern the moment you decided to trade a human soul for a handful of silver," the stranger countered. "That's not law, and it sure as hell isn't honor." Miller laughed, a harsh barking sound. He turned his head and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near the stranger's boots. "Honor don't pay debts, drifter." "Neither does cowardice," the mountain man said softly. That one word, cowardice, ignited the powder keg. The air grew tight, vibrating with the promise of violence. The soldiers stiffened, their fingers twitching on the triggers of their rifles. But the mountain man didn't move a muscle. He stood like a statue, waiting. "If you want to take her," Miller growled, a threatening smile twisting his scarred lips, "you'll have to go through us." "If necessary," the stranger replied. Then the world exploded into chaos. The mountain man moved with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for a man of his size. In a blur of motion, he lunged at the nearest soldier, disarming him with a sharp, brutal crack to the wrist and snatching the rifle from his hands. Before anyone could react, he fired a single shot into the night sky. The retort of the rifle was deafening. Horses tethered nearby reared and screamed, tearing at their reins. Men shouted, diving for cover as the square dissolved into panic. In the confusion, Sarah felt a strong hand grip her arm, pulling her away from the table, away from the captain, and away from the life she had known. "Run!" the stranger commanded, his voice cutting through the din. She didn't ask questions, she ran. She ran alongside this terrifying savior, leaving behind the curses of the soldiers and the shattered remains of her dignity. They sprinted toward the tree line, toward the vast, dark wilderness that loomed beyond the settlement lights. Behind her, a voice cried out, pitiful and weak. "Sarah! Sarah, wait!" It was Jeb, her father, but his voice sounded ghostly, fading into the distance. Sarah didn't look back. In that moment, the bond was severed. She was no longer his daughter, no longer his property to barter. She was running for her life. The wilderness swallowed them whole. The shadows of the scrub brush and the towering rocks enveloped them as if they had never existed. Sarah's lungs burned like fire, her legs trembling with every stride, but terror kept her moving. The stranger was ahead of her, moving through the treacherous terrain with the grace of a mountain lion, dodging rocks and dry bushes without breaking his stride. He didn't check to see if she could keep up. He simply forged a path, and Sarah knew she had a choice: follow him into the unknown, or stay behind and die. From behind them, the shouts of the soldiers grew fainter, but they didn't stop. Crack, crack. The dry snap of gunfire echoed off the canyon walls. Bullets whizzed through the air, cutting leaves and striking stone, but none found their mark. The stranger seemed to know exactly where to step, guiding her through narrow ravines and invisible deer trails where the soldiers' heavy horses couldn't follow. They ran until the moon was high and the night turned bone-chillingly cold. They ran until Sarah's vision blurred and her legs felt like they were made of lead. Finally, her body gave out. She stumbled over a root and crashed to her knees on the hard, rocky earth. Her dress was torn, her hands scraped and bleeding. She tried to push herself up, to force her limbs to obey, but they refused. She collapsed, gasping for air, tears mixing with the dust on her face. The stranger stopped a few yards ahead. He turned slowly, watching her. There was no impatience in his stance, no judgment. He just waited, letting her catch her breath, standing guard against the dark. When Sarah finally managed to lift her head, looking at him through a veil of messy hair, he extended a hand toward her. She flinched. She didn't take it. She looked at him with a mix of fear and anger, her chest heaving. "Who are you?" she rasped, her voice raw. "What do you want from me?" The man slowly lowered his hand, showing her his palms were empty. "My name is Silas," he said, his voice deep and steady, "and I want nothing from you." "Then why?" Sarah demanded, tears streaming down her dirty cheeks. "Why did you get me out of there? Why did you risk your life for a stranger?" Silas crouched down, keeping a respectful distance, like one might approach a spooked colt. "Because what I saw back there, it wasn't right," he said simply. "A woman isn't an object to be handed over to settle a gambler's accounts. You don't know me, and you don't owe me. But everyone deserves dignity." Sarah clenched her fists in the dirt. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to hit him. She wanted to wake up from this nightmare where her own father had sold her like a sack of feed. But the anger drained out of her as quickly as it had come, leaving only a hollow, aching grief. She lowered her head and wept. She cried for the 11 years of servitude, for the humiliation in the square, and for the betrayal that cut deeper than any knife. Silas didn't try to hush her. He didn't offer empty words or false promises that everything would be all right. He simply walked over to a nearby boulder and sat down, watching the horizon, standing sentinel while she poured out the poison of her past. When her tears finally dried, leaving her feeling scraped hollow but strangely lighter, Silas stood up. "We have to keep moving," he said gently. "They'll be tracking us. We can't stay here." Sarah wiped her face with the tattered sleeve of her dress. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling. "To a safe place," Silas promised. "There's a cave about 3 hours' ride, or walk in our case, from here. We can rest there. They won't find us tonight." Sarah nodded weakly. She had burned every bridge she ever had. There was no going back to the cabin, no going back to Jeb. She had nothing and no one waiting for her. Silas began to walk again, and this time Sarah followed not out of fear, but because she had nowhere else to go. They walked in silence as the true cold of the high desert set in. Sarah shivered violently, her thin dress offering no protection against the biting wind. Silas noticed. He stopped by a cluster of dry brush and quickly gathered a handful of branches, tying them together with a strip of leather from his belt. In minutes, he struck flint against steel, and a small improvised torch flared to life. The firelight pushed back the shadows and offered a small, merciful warmth. "Don't fear the fire," he said, seeing her glance nervously at the darkness. "We're far enough away now. They won't see the light." "How can you be so sure?" Sarah asked. "Because I know this wilderness better than they know their own barracks," Silas replied, his eyes scanning the gloom. "I've been walking these trails for years." "Are you a mountain man?" she asked hesitantly. "I am," he said. "Came to the post to trade horses. Didn't expect to find something worse than a trader's greed." Sarah fell silent. She had heard the stories, that mountain men were savages, killers without mercy. But walking behind this man, seeing the way he moved and hearing the quiet respect in his voice, he didn't seem like a monster. He seemed more human than her father, and certainly more human than the captain. Finally, they reached the cave. It was a narrow slit in the rock face, hidden behind a thicket of mesquite and sagebrush. Silas held the branches aside and guided her in. It wasn't much, just a small dry hollow protected from the wind, but to Sarah, it looked like a palace. Inside, Silas leaned the torch against the stone wall and immediately began building a small fire from wood stored in the back of the cave. As the flames grew, illuminating the cramped space, Sarah slumped against the wall, hugging her knees. She watched the fire dance, her body exhausted but her mind racing. She was alive. She was free. But the challenge had just begun. The warmth of the fire hit Sarah in waves, thawing the chill that had settled deep in her bones. But inside she felt frozen. She sat against the rough stone wall of the cave, hugging her knees to her chest, while Silas sat on the opposite side of the small blaze. His pistol rested on his lap, his eyes fixed on the cave entrance, watching the dancing shadows as if they might turn into soldiers at any moment. He reached for a leather canteen at his belt, uncorked it, and offered it to her. "Drink," he said, his voice low. "Not too much. We have to ration it." Sarah took the canteen with trembling hands. The water was warm and tasted of leather, but to her parched throat it was sweeter than the finest wine. She took 2 long gulps before handing it back. Silas took a sip himself, his eyes never leaving the dark opening of the cave. Silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. Sarah watched him from the corner of her eye. In the firelight, the lines on his face looked deeper, like dried riverbeds. He wasn't a young man. maybe 40 winters on him, but he moved with a vitality that men half his age didn't possess. He had scars on his arms, stories written in flesh that hinted at a life of violence and survival. "Why did you do it?" she asked again, the question gnawing at her. "Really? Why save a nobody like me?" Silas didn't look at her immediately. He stared into the embers, his expression darkening. "Because I lost something once, and nobody helped me." "What did you lose?" He remained silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded distant, echoing from a place of old, jagged pain. "My family, my wife, Alara, and my son. He was only 7 years old." Sarah felt a pang in her chest. "It was 8 years ago," Silas continued. "I was out hunting, days away from our cabin. Soldiers attacked at dawn. They claimed they were looking for rebels, but they were just looking to cause harm. When I got back, it was too late. I found them by the door." He looked up then, his eyes locking with hers. "I learned something that day, Sarah. I learned that silence is complicit. If you see something wrong, something evil, and you do nothing, you're just as guilty as the man pulling the trigger. I didn't want to be complicit in what they were doing to you." Sarah lowered her gaze. They were 2 broken people, sitting in the dirt, bound by loss. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "but I don't know what I'm going to do now. I have nowhere to go. I have nothing." "Now you have your life," Silas replied firmly. "That's more than you had this morning." "What happens tomorrow?" she asked, fear creeping back into her voice. "Tomorrow you choose," Silas said. "When we reach the high country, if you want to return to civilization, I'll take you to a different settlement. Or, if you want to keep going, I'll teach you how to survive. But the choice is yours. Not your father's, not the captain's, yours." For the first time in her life, the chains of expectation shattered. Sarah closed her eyes and, despite the hard ground and the looming danger, fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. While she slept, miles away in Dust Creek, the lights of the garrison were burning bright. Captain Miller stood before a group of 7 hand-picked soldiers, his face twisted in fury. Beside him stood Jeb, looking small and pathetic, wringing his hat in his hands. "We find them," Miller growled, slamming a fist onto his desk. "And when we do, that mountain trash will pay for humiliating me. And the girl, she comes back to where she belongs." Jeb nodded nervously. He didn't want Sarah back for love. He needed her back because the men in the saloon were laughing at him. He was the fool who lost his daughter and his dignity in one hand of cards. He had to get her back, Jeb told himself, for his own sake. Back in the wilderness, the sun rose with a brutal intensity. Silas woke Sarah before the light had even fully touched the canyon floor. "Time to move," he said, kicking dirt over the fire. They walked for hours under a sun that felt like a hammer. Sarah felt like she was melting, every step heavier than the last. But she bit her tongue. She wouldn't complain. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was a survivor in the making. By midday, they reached a dried-up creek bed. The earth was cracked and parched. Sarah looked at it with despair, licking her cracked lips. "Watch," Silas said. He knelt in the sand, digging with his hands until the soil turned dark and damp. A moment later, a small pool of muddy but fresh water seeped up. He filled the canteen and let her drink first. "The wilderness will kill you if you don't know how to read it," he said, wiping his brow. "You have to learn to see what others miss." Sarah wiped her mouth, a new fire igniting in her eyes. "Teach me," she said. Silas looked at her surprised. He had expected tears or exhaustion. Instead, he saw hunger. Hunger for power, for control, for life. "All right," he nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I'll teach you." That afternoon, under the shade of a twisted pine, the real training began. Silas pulled a small knife with a bone handle from his boot and handed it to her. "It's yours," he said. "Always carry it." Sarah held the weapon awkwardly. It felt heavy, dangerous. "I don't know how to use this." "You'll learn. A knife isn't just for killing," Silas explained patiently. "It's for cutting meat, carving wood, making tools. It's for life." For the next few hours, he showed her how to grip it, how to sharpen the blade against a smooth stone, and how to make precise cuts. Sarah was clumsy at first. She nicked her thumb, watching a bead of bright red blood well up. But she didn't stop. She focused, her brow furrowed, absorbing every instruction like dry earth absorbs rain. "Good," Silas said when she finally stripped the bark off a branch in one clean motion. "You're learning to trust your hands." As the sun began to dip, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, Sarah felt a change within her. The girl who had swept floors and taken orders was dying out here in the dust. Something new was being forged in the heat of the desert, something sharper, harder, and ready to fight. But as she practiced, Silas stood up abruptly, his head cocked to the wind. He walked to the edge of the ridge, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the back trail. "What is it?" Sarah asked, sensing the shift in his mood. "Silence," Silas whispered. "The birds have stopped singing down in the valley." He turned to her, his face grim. "They're coming, and they're moving fast." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage and imminent danger. Silas didn't panic. He simply shifted gears. The time for hiding was over. The time for fighting had arrived. "If they're tracking us, they'll be moving fast," Silas said, his eyes scanning the rugged terrain. "We have maybe a day before they catch up. Today you learn to fight." He took her to a clearing surrounded by high, jagged rocks. "I'm not teaching you to be a soldier, Sarah. I'm teaching you not to be a victim." For the next few hours, the canyon became a training ground. Silas didn't go easy on her. He lunged, he grabbed, he pushed her into the dirt. Again and again, Sarah hit the hard ground, spitting out dust, her muscles screaming in protest. But every time she fell, she got up faster. She got up angrier. "Don't fight with strength," Silas barked as she tried to shove him back. "He will always be stronger than you. Fight with your head. Use his weight against him. Be smarter. Be faster." Sarah gritted her teeth, wiping sweat from her eyes. When Silas lunged again, she didn't try to block him. She sidestepped, dropping her shoulder and driving her elbow into his ribs. It wasn't a knockout blow, but it was precise, and it knocked the wind out of him. Silas stepped back, rubbing his side. A genuine smile broke across his weathered face. A rare sight. "Good," he nodded. "Very good. You're no longer the woman I pulled out of that square." That evening, as the sun bled crimson over the peaks, the mood shifted. They sat by a small, concealed fire, eating dried rabbit meat. Sarah looked at Silas, really looked at him. The firelight softened the hard planes of his face. He wasn't just a savior anymore. He was a partner. "What happens after?" Sarah asked quietly into the silence. "If we survive this, what do we do?" Silas poked the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise like fireflies. "I don't know," he admitted. "I haven't looked past the next sunrise in years. But with you, I find myself thinking about mornings I haven't seen yet." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. It wasn't a flowery declaration of love. It was something sturdier. It was hope. "Me too," she whispered. "For the first time, I want a future. I want to be free." Silas reached out, his rough, calloused hand covering hers. They sat there as the stars wheeled overhead, two souls forging a bond stronger than steel. But the peace was fragile. They both knew the storm was coming at dawn. The next morning, Silas led her to a narrow, twisting ravine known as Coyote Pass. High walls of red rock rose on either side, creating a natural choke point. "This is it," Silas said, pointing down at the trail. "If they come, they have to come through here." He turned to her, his expression serious. "Sarah, listen to me. I can take you higher into the mountains. There are trails they don't know. I can get you to my people's land. You'd be safe there. You don't have to do this." Sarah looked at the pass, then back at him. Fear was there, yes, cold and biting in her gut. But beneath it was a bedrock of resolve she had built brick by brick over the last few days. "No," she said firmly. "I'm done running, Silas. If I run now, I'll be running for the rest of my life. I'll always be afraid. I want to face them. I want Jeb to see who I've become." Silas studied her face, searching for any sign of hesitation. Finding none, he nodded. "All right. But understand this. Once it starts, there is no turning back. Are you willing to do what needs to be done?" "I am," she replied. And she meant it. The girl who swept floors was dead. The woman standing on the ridge was ready for war. They spent the afternoon preparing the ground. Silas showed her how to set simple traps. Stones placed just so to make a horse stumble, brush arranged to look like solid ground. They memorized firing positions and escape routes. By sunset, the trap was set. At dawn, the wait ended. From their perch high in the rocks, Sarah saw it first, a plume of yellow dust rising against the blue sky. Her heart hammered against her ribs, loud enough she feared they might hear it. "Steady," Silas whispered from beside her. "Breathe." The riders emerged from the dust, 8 of them. Jeb was in the lead, riding a thin, nervous mare, his hat pulled low. Behind him rode Captain Miller and 6 soldiers, rifles resting across their saddles, eyes scanning the cliffs. They rode with the arrogance of men who owned the world. They didn't see the tripwire. They didn't see the loose rocks. "Something ain't right," Miller muttered, pulling on his reins about 100 yards out. The horses snorted, sensing the ambush before the men did. "It's just a trapper and a girl," Jeb complained, his voice shrill in the canyon air. "Let's just go get her." "A mountain man is worth 10 soldiers if he knows the ground," Miller snapped. But his pride won out. He signaled the advance. As the lead horse stepped into the narrowest part of the pass, its hoof caught the trap. The animal reared, screaming, throwing its rider hard into the dirt. "Now!" Silas yelled. His rifle cracked, the sound echoing like thunder. A soldier spun from his saddle, clutching his shoulder. Chaos erupted below. Horses panicked, men shouted orders that were lost in the noise. Sarah gripped the pistol Silas had given her, her palms sweaty against the wood grip. She saw a soldier raising his rifle toward Silas's position. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She aimed and squeezed the trigger. The gun kicked hard, the shot ringing out drier and louder than she expected. The soldier buckled, dropping to one knee. Captain Miller whipped his head around, his eyes locking onto her silhouette against the rocks. Recognition twisted his face into a snarl. "There she is!" he roared, pointing a gloved finger. "Bring her to me alive!" 2 soldiers spurred their horses toward the slope, scrambling up the loose shale toward her. The ambush had turned into a brawl. Sarah took a breath, steadied her hand, and prepared to defend her freedom with everything she had. The soldier was on her in a heartbeat, smelling of sweat and stale tobacco. He slapped the pistol from her hand, the weapon skittering across the rocks. "Got you now," he growled, his fingers digging into her arm like iron claws. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't beg. In that terrifying split second, Silas's voice echoed in her mind. "Don't fight with strength, fight with intelligence." She went limp, letting the soldier think he had won, letting him believe she was just a frightened girl. He grinned, relaxing his grip for just a fraction of a second. That was all she needed. Sarah's hand flew to her belt, drawing the bone-handled knife. With a sharp cry, she drove it into his side. The man howled, releasing her and stumbling back, shock written all over his face. Before his partner could raise his rifle to retaliate, a shot rang out from the cliffs above. Silas had dropped him with a single, clean shot through the chest. Dust and gun smoke swirled through the pass. Captain Miller, seeing his men falling like wheat before a scythe, dove behind his dead horse, firing blindly into the rocks. But the battle had shifted. Then a voice cut through the ringing in Sarah's ears. "Sarah!" It was Jeb. He wasn't fighting. He was hiding behind a boulder, clutching his rifle with trembling hands. Sarah moved toward him, picking up her pistol. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but her hand was steady. Jeb looked up, his face pale and streaked with dirt. When he saw the gun pointed at his chest, his eyes went wide. "Sarah, no," he stammered. "I'm your pa. You owe me." "I owe you nothing," Sarah said, her voice cold as the mountain wind. "I was your daughter because I had no choice. I worked your land because I had nowhere else to go. But the moment you sold me to settle a bet, you cut the only tie we had." "It was a mistake," Jeb cried, tears streaming down his face. "I was drunk. I was desperate. Come back with me. We'll go back to the cabin. It'll be like before." "Like before?" Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "You mean silence and servitude?" "No." "I promise I'll change," Jeb pleaded, falling to his knees. "I'm going to give you what you never gave me, Jeb," Sarah said softly. "I'm going to give you a choice. You can turn around, walk back to the settlement, and tell them I died in these mountains. You can live. Or you can keep believing you own me and you can die right here." Jeb stared at her. He didn't see a person. He saw property that had rebelled. His shame turned to sudden, blinding rage. "You ungrateful wretch!" he screamed, snatching his rifle up from the dirt. Sarah didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger. The shot thundered through the canyon. Jeb fell backward, a look of eternal surprise frozen on his face. The rifle clattered uselessly to the stones. He was gone. Silence fell over Coyote Pass. Captain Miller, witnessing the girl kill her own father and seeing the mountain man descending from the rocks like an avenging angel, knew the day was lost. There was no profit here, only death. He scrambled onto the last remaining horse and spurred it hard, fleeing back toward the valley without looking back. Silas reached Sarah a moment later. He glanced at Jeb's body, then at her. "Are you all right?" Sarah lowered the gun. She felt no joy, but she felt lighter. The heavy blanket of fear she had worn for years was gone. "I'm free," she whispered. "For the first time, I'm truly free." "We can go back," Silas offered gently. "Explain it was self-defense." "Go back to what?" Sarah shook her head, looking out at the vast, rugged horizon. "That town watched me get sold and did nothing. I don't belong there." She turned to Silas. "I want to go with you. I want to see the high country. I want to learn the rest of what you know." Silas smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "My world is hard, Sarah, but you'll never be owned by anyone again." They took what supplies they needed and mounted two of the soldiers' horses. As they rode west, toward the peaks that scratched the sky, the legend of Sarah began to take root. Back in Dust Creek, they would whisper about the girl with no price, not because she was worthless, but because her spirit could not be bought. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a debt. She was a warrior. And that, my friends, is where we leave Sarah and Silas riding into a sunset that belongs only to them. If this story got your blood pumping and your heart racing, do me a favor and lasso that like button. It helps the channel more than you know. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss a tale from the frontier. I want to hear from you. What do you think happened to them next? Did they become legends of the high country? Let me know your theories in the comments below and tell me what kind of story you want to hear next week. Check out the playlist on your screen for more gritty tales of survival and justice. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon. Take care, folks.